The 1st of September 1939, the world did not know, on that morning when German armor rolled across the Polish frontier, that its skies would become a graveyard of metal and fire, nor that a single encounter between two pilots who should have been enemies would see the story. That would take 4 decades to complete. It began long before either of them saw each other, long before the smoke of dogfights curled into the cold air shaped by invisible forces moving beneath the surface of the war, by intelligence games played in sealed rooms, by secret decisions that never reached the newspapers, and by quiet acts of mercy that defied the machinery of violence grinding the world into dust. The war was already shifting in its unseen gears when James Harrington, a young American who had grown up watching barnstormers slice their planes across Midwestern skies, read the first reports of Europe burning. He didn't know it yet, but the conflict would pull him into a labyrinth of clandestine missions, coded transmissions, and moral contradictions so profound that even decades later he would struggle to understand why his life had been spared, and why the man who spared it had carried the burden of that moment like a phantom pressing on his chest every night thereafter. James enlisted long before the United States officially entered the war. The American volunteer groups, covertly assembled with presidential approval but shielded behind layers of deniability, were already training pilots to aid Allied forces in regions the public barely thought about. China, Burma, the North Atlantic silent battlegrounds where ideologies clashed long before. Pearl Harbor forced the United States into open conflict. By 1941, James had become an intelligence courier masked as a supply pilot, flying routes that took him along the black edges of German-controlled airspace. The EOS had not yet formally taken shape, but embryonic cells of what would become America's principal wartime intelligence organization were already running shadow operations. Pilots like James were occasionally diverted from supply runs and given sealed envelopes, coded ciphers that had to be memorized, or reconnaissance missions disguised as mechanical tests. And though he wore the uniform of an ordinary airman, he carried secrets through the sky. Secrets that could alter diplomatic maneuvering, underground resistance communications, or even Allied planning in ways that he rarely understood at the time, across the ocean. Franz Keller lived a life shaped by a different kind of inevitability. A child of the Great War, he had watched his father come home with missing fingers and haunted eyes. Franz grew up in a Germany destabilized by economic collapse, political extremism, and shifting propaganda that seeped into every corner of society. By the time he joined the Luftwaffe, he was no longer certain where personal belief ended and national ideology began. Yet he was known for his precision, his restraint, and a peculiar habit his squadron mates noticed only after months. Flying together, he hesitated just for a second before firing on a disabled enemy plane. Some called it weakness. Others thought it a kind of instinctive humanity he could never quite smother. His superiors never knew this, but the intelligence officers who quietly monitored pilot behavior in the Luftwaffe psychological units took note. The German High Command had more interest in psychological profiling than history fully records, using early behavioral science to attempt predictions of combat reliability. Franz passed, but his file included a remark that he possessed an unusual aversion to unnecessary destruction, an anomaly. In a military machine built on rigid calculation, their paths converged on a cold morning in 1943. Though the roots of that day were tangled in covert decisions neither man ever learned about until decades later, Allied intelligence believed that German command centers in Western France were receiving signals from a clandestine network of sympathizers in neutral territories. James had been rerouted from his routine supply mission and given a classified objective: verify the existence of an encoded signal relay somewhere near Brest. The EOS had intercepted fragments, and they needed aerial confirmation. It was supposed to be simple. Fly low, photograph the suspected relay tower, return before Luftwaffe patrols crossed into that sector. But wartime skies were rarely bound to human plans. Weather shifted. Radar signals flickered, and some intelligence officers later admitted long after documents were declassified that this particular mission involved deeper layers of misdirection intended to confuse. German analysts monitoring Allied aerial patterns. James was flying through the fog of deception manufactured by both sides, unaware that his mission was not merely reconnaissance but part of a psychological operation designed to spread uncertainty within German command intelligence. France had been scrambled from a nearby airfield as Allied bomber formations passed north, and his squadron was split to intercept multiple threats. Radar screens of the time, primitive and unreliable, had detected movement in several directions, much of it false or distorted, unknown to either Franz or James. British intelligence had begun deploying airborne, chaff-thin strips of aluminum designed to confuse German radar, creating phantom signals that scattered Luftwaffe patrol routes unpredictably. Franz was sent south, where he spotted a lone American aircraft flying lower than expected, cutting across a valley where no bombing run made sense. As he descended, he noticed the telltale glint of camera equipment mounted on the underside of the fuselage. He realized instantly that the pilot was on a reconnaissance assignment. James saw the Messerschmitt seconds too late. He banked hard, pushing the engine near its red line, but Franz was a master of angles. His movements clean, precise, terrifyingly efficient. A burst of fire nicked James's right wing, another cut through the tail. He felt the plane shudder violently. Smoke filled the cockpit. He tried to stabilize as the altimeter dropped, the ground rising toward him like a dark wave ready to swallow him whole. Franz closed in for the final strike, but then the hesitation returned, sharper than ever. He saw the helpless angle of the spinning American plane, the limp way its wings wobbled. There was no fight left in it, no threat. And in that instant, an instant shaped by everything he had lived through, the memories of his father, the erosion of certainty, the quiet voice inside him that refused to be silenced, Franz lifted his finger off the trigger instead of firing. He flew alongside the falling aircraft and positioned himself so James could see him through the smoke-stained window. His gloved hand extended outward in a gesture few would believe if the story had not been corroborated years later. He pointed downward, signaling toward an open field free of obstacles, guiding the dying plane toward a survivable crash landing. James, disoriented but conscious, followed the motion, barely coaxing his aircraft into a rough, bone-breaking descent. The impact felt like the world collapsing into itself. But he lived. The act of mercy defied orders, doctrine, propaganda, and the logic of war itself. It would haunt both men forever. James spent months recovering in a British field hospital, unable to shake the image of the German pilot who could have killed him with a twitch of a finger, but chose not to. He described the encounter to multiple intelligence officers, but his story was buried amid a flood of wartime reports. The OSS had more pressing matters, preparing resistance networks in occupied France, decoding Enigma variations, coordinating psychological warfare broadcasts aimed at eroding German morale. James was drawn deeper into those shadows after his recovery, recruited to support airdrop operations for resistance cells that were themselves rife with infiltrators planted by the Gestapo. He saw firsthand how information became a battlefield, how forged documents, misdirection campaigns, and double agents shaped outcomes as much as bullets did. Franz, meanwhile, was questioned by his superiors after returning with ammunition unspent. German intelligence units, aware of Allied psychological strategies, had begun suspecting any deviation from aggressive protocol as potential ideological contamination. But Franz fabricated a believable explanation. He claimed cloud cover had obstructed his sight, preventing a clean shot. Ironically, the Luftwaffe valued precision so highly that a pilot who missed due to environmental factors was treated with less suspicion than one who hesitated out of conscience. Still, the burden of what he had done pressed on him. He flew dozens more missions, watched comrades die, carried out orders that left villages in flames. And every time he fired on an enemy later in the war, he felt a contradiction twisting inside him. A reminder that he had once let an enemy live and perhaps irrationally wished more moments like that existed in a world that seemed determined to extinguish them. Germany's collapse in 1945 scattered its soldiers across a scarred continent. Franz deserted in the final days, slipping away from his unit as Soviet artillery thundered across the outskirts of Berlin. His decision was shaped not only by fear of capture but by a deep exhaustion with the war's moral corrosion. He surrendered to American forces, spent time in a POW camp in Belgium, and eventually rebuilt a quiet life as a mechanic in a small town that bore no resemblance to the nation the propaganda once promised. He told no one about the pilot he spared, though the memory remained the one moment in the war that restored something human inside him. James survived the war but was never the same. He struggled with survivor's guilt, with the psychological debris left by intelligence operations whose consequences he could never fully measure. In the decades that followed, he participated in classified interviews as part of America's Cold War intelligence assessments. The CIA, inheritor of OSS remnants, sought to understand which wartime psychological tactics had proven effective. During one such interview, he recounted the story of the German pilot again. This time, the interviewer and archivist familiar with Luftwaffe combat logs recognized details that matched an unexplained entry from a German squadron near Brest. It was the first thread James had ever been given. From that thread grew an obsession that would last 40 years. He searched through wartime records, wrote letters to German veterans associations, dug into archives as they were gradually declassified. The quest became a private war against the silence of history, a refusal to let the moment of mercy disappear into the abyss of forgotten deeds. He learned about the German psychological profiling programs, about the secret intelligence units that monitored pilot behavior. He studied the radar confusion caused by chaff, the misdirected patrol orders, the clandestine Allied operations that had indirectly placed him in France's path. Every document revealed another layer of complexity, another reminder that individual humanity existed within vast systems designed to crush it. In 1983, he received a reply from a German veteran who recognized the description, a man who had served with Franz Keller. Franz was still alive. They exchanged letters, cautious at first, then growing heavy with the unspoken weight of shared history. Their meeting, when it finally happened, felt less like a reunion than the closing of a circle torn open by war. Franz confessed that he had spent decades wondering whether the man he spared had survived the crash or burned in the wreckage. James admitted he had spent just as long desperate to thank the stranger who had given him a second life. Their conversation moved between memory and silence, between guilt and gratitude. Franz spoke of the confusion in the final years of the war, of missions fueled by propaganda and fear, of the psychological toll of being both a weapon and a man trying not to lose himself. James spoke of the intelligence operations he had been part of how secret decisions and coded strategies had shaped the battlefield in ways most soldiers would never understand. They found in each other not answers but recognition and acknowledgement, that humanity can flicker even in the darkest machinery of war. Their bond deepened in the years that followed. They visited historical sites together, giving interviews that emphasized not heroism but the fragile, difficult choices individuals make when trapped inside the grinding logic of conflict. They spoke of how war creates myths of glory to mask the far more painful truths about moral ambiguity, about the trauma carried in silence, about the hidden layers of strategy and intelligence games that turn human lives into expendable variables. They wanted people to understand that behind every recorded battle lay unrecorded stories, acts of mercy overshadowed by violence, decisions that defied ideology. The world often prefers clear lines: enemy and ally, hero and villain, but their story revealed something far more unsettling. In the heart of war, the line between destruction and compassion can hinge on a single breath, a moment of hesitation, a decision made by a man who should have been a killer but instead chose to be human. And sometimes that decision is powerful enough to echo across 40 years, powerful enough to transform two former enemies into brothers bound not by blood, but by the fragile miracle of mercy. They spoke publicly only a few times, often resisting attempts by journalists to dramatize or oversimplify their encounter. What they shared privately, however, reflected the deeper currents of the war they had lived through, the psychological operations that manipulated perception, The intelligence wars that left even soldiers unaware of the motives behind their missions. The forgotten strategies buried in archives. They had both been pawns in larger games, yet in one moment had defied the logic of those games entirely. Their final years were peaceful, spent in correspondence and occasional visits, but marked by the knowledge that their story carried a truth larger than themselves. They had lived through a war shaped not only by armies and strategies, but by the unseen web of espionage, propaganda, and psychological engineering that defined the 20th century's greatest conflict. And amid that vast, shadowed world, a single act of mercy had cut through the darkness and altered the trajectory of two lives. When Franz died first, James carried the loss heavily. He spoke at a small service attended by only a few relatives. His voice trembled as he said the words he had waited 40 years to speak, that the man buried before them had saved his life, and by doing so had saved a part of his soul he would otherwise have lost to the war. When James passed several years later, a copy of Franz's first letter was found among his belongings. Worn at the edges as if held many times, their story remains one of the rare, fragile reminders that even in the deepest shadows of war, amid intelligence games, propaganda battles, and the hidden machinery that consumes human lives, there can be moments where an individual chooses compassion over violence, humanity over ideology, life over death. Moments that do not rewrite history but illuminate it. Moments that show how fragile, how unpredictable, how profoundly human even the darkest chapters of the past can be.